and welcome to this session of Leto Lectures as we conclude another year of ongoing educational enrichment programming, and at the same time, of course, bring to an end this long, challenging, exhaustive process of looking at the American presidential election in 2020. Today's lecture will be entitled, What Now? A post-mortem analysis of the 2020 election. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone for your perseverance, your endurance, and your patience. You know that when we began the year 2020, we thought that just like in election cycles in the past, we were going to present a series of live presentations directly to you at your communities, as we've done in the past, in a way to make our way towards Election Day, November the 3rd, 2020. Of course, somewhere along the line, COVID made it impossible for us to continue to meet in person. And I know that many of you had to go to greater lengths sometimes to access these lectures. Some of the more tech-savvy of you maybe have utilized the video link that we've provided in order to watch it within the comfort of your own laptop or your own iPad. I know that your communities have worked very hard to give all of you an opportunity to stay on the same page as we made our way month by month, topic through topic. Just a little bit of an inside story. It hasn't been very easy for me to suddenly convert these presentations to video, given the fact that up to this point, all my presentations have been live. We've created this makeshift studio. It's actually part of my library in my home, and these are actually real books, most of which I've even read, and filmed and then later produced and edited these lectures, which we've sent on to you. Oftentimes, in order to replicate the feel of a live audience being there, listening as I spoke, I enlisted family members, particularly children, who earlier during the COVID challenge had come to repopulate what was an empty nest for a while, and made them sit on the other side of the camera so that there could be some feeling of live folks actually listening. Couple of anecdotes. In one case, as I was speaking, and I'm sure making a scintillating point about something that we were discussing, my daughter's phone rang, and I had to give her a dirty look. We had to stop, and we have to pick up again. On another occasion, my wife, who for a very long time has been my lone audience, even though she denies it, I saw nodding off, kind of falling asleep in the midst of one of my lectures, which everyone knows sometimes occurs, but is a mortal sin, certainly ego wounding. So again, some of the challenges that from this side of the camera we've encountered in making sure we keep up with the topics at hand. Now, today's lecture, again, entitled, What Now? A post-mortem analysis of the 2020 election, is partially a continuation of last month's lecture, which was America Votes, but is now a look more deeply into what is taking place after most of the votes, all of the votes for practical purposes, have been counted, and all of the states in one way or another have certified the results in their individual states. We know that this, of course, is a culmination of a very long process that every 4 years tends to get longer and longer and longer as our vaunted, I say this somewhat sarcastically, two-party system goes through processes to narrow down a field of candidates where one will be the standard bearer in their parties come election day. We began this year recognizing that there was an incumbent president who was seeking re-election, President Trump, so that unlike in 2016, where President Obama could not seek another term, and thus both Democrat and Republican candidates fought it out in long primary battles, this was going to be one where President Trump, the presumptive nominee of his party, was going to go virtually unchallenged month by month by month, winning overwhelming majorities in primaries and caucuses that took place in just about every state. While on the other hand, the Democrats produced a long roster of candidates, all of whom believed that they were going to be their party's nominee. We know, of course, that ideologically in the United States, each party has a tremendous amount of ground to cover in a standard political spectrum. We know that from the political center all the way to the very far right, the Republican Party and its nominee has to somehow satisfy the desires of slightly moderate, just right of center Republicans, all the way to those who may be, again, more conservative, much farther to the right than the political center. We saw this year, however, the flip side of this phenomenon. We've seen how Democrats typically have to satisfy and appeal to those Democrats who consider themselves just left of center, maybe more centrist than anything else, all the way to the far left, which in these times constitutes candidates who variously describe themselves as perhaps socialist or progressive. So we saw the Democratic field fill out. Actually, it began to fill out in the summer of 2019. As the year came to an end, we would see the first of the debates, and we would see a number of candidates arrayed along the left side of the political spectrum. Most notably, of course, the eventual nominee, the now president-elect, Joe Biden, started from a just left of center position. Joe Biden is a well-known quantity. Some might say, a very long-known quantity in American politics. And for the most part, Joe Biden has been a centrist politically, left of center, but nonetheless closer to the center. We watched as other candidates came into the field, some of them like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, again running on this more centrist, just left of center position. But then as we moved further and further to the left, we saw candidates like Andrew Yang, notably Elizabeth Warren, and of course Bernie Sanders, come to represent some of the more farther left of center positions and ideas that Democrats had been debating among and between themselves. So as the calendar turned to 2020, February was the month in which we saw, of course, the Iowa caucuses, followed by the New Hampshire presidential primary, and saw that Joe Biden didn't do particularly well in either of those races. In fact, it wasn't until February the 29th of this year, after a very strong endorsement from South Carolina Congressman James Clyburn, that Biden scored a resounding victory in the South Carolina presidential primary, particularly among South Carolina's strong, large African-American voting population, so that as Super Tuesday dawned and races in the Midwest and in the South and in the far West were going to be on the ballot, areas that Biden was expected to do much better in, candidates began falling like flies between February the 9th and Super Tuesday March the 3rd, we would see candidates like Buttigieg, like Kamala Harris, like Amy Klobuchar leave the race. We would see Mike Bloomberg eventually go down with the ship when he failed to make much of a showing in the Florida primary. And we saw for a while a battle between Bernie Sanders, possibly Elizabeth Warren, but she left the race shortly after Super Tuesday. So the race became one essentially for a while between the centrist Biden and the self-described Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders. Again, a lot of belief that the heart and the soul of the Democratic Party was going to be on the line as these candidates might battle through March, April, May, and even into June. However, we know that by mid-March, that pesky novel coronavirus, as it was first known as, later given, of course, an official name, COVID-19, would come along and disrupt just about every aspect of American life. We would undergo several weeks of federally ordered shutdowns where only essential workers were able to go out and do their jobs. We would see, of course, our lectures, for whatever it's worth, as something relevant, come to an end in live fashion, and we turn to video. We would eventually see the effects on employment, on the stock market, on the country's health. We would see Congress infuse trillions of dollars into the economy to try to keep it afloat during these challenging shutdowns. And we would see from mid-March onward many states whose primaries and or caucuses were scheduled to take place in the following months postpone them. And many were not actually held until the summer, in June and even July, when we received a respite of sorts from the onset of COVID-19 cases. The result of this was to see Bernie Sanders leave the race, probably sooner than he would have otherwise, and Joe Biden suddenly pick up the mantle of presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, facing off, of course, against President Trump, seeking a second term in the White House. Now, in our last lecture, we noted a couple of things. Number one, it's very difficult to, in modern times, defeat an incumbent president seeking a second term. There are certain benefits to incumbency that more open-ended fundraising, social media, the ability to project the power of the office of president while at the same time campaigning. How many times did we see Air Force One parked adjacent to airport hangars as President Trump was making his case to the American public? All of these factors have made an incumbent president more difficult to defeat. In a bit, we are going to recite many of the accomplishments of the Trump administration and recognize that if COVID had not emerged to be the October surprise of this election cycle way back in March, causing many Americans to focus, like we often do, away from international issues, and in some cases, some notable foreign policy accomplishments of the Trump administration, and also turn away from a lot of the more political noise, the accusations of improprieties exchanged among and between candidates, to focus almost primarily on COVID. President Trump might have been on his way to winning a second term as president. A very good economy, that we saw at the end of 2020. Low unemployment, a strong stock market, wage growth among those Americans who are the lowest earning of our population were factors that tended to inure to the benefit of President Trump, but generally to any incumbent seeking re-election as well. COVID sort of threw all of that formula and all of these axioms about defeating incumbents out the window. And we watched, of course, through a number of very trying months, as President Trump had a difficult time finalizing a federal governmental response to COVID, particularly regarding testing, regarding shutdowns, regarding social distancing and the wearing of masks. And we recognize that perhaps for reasons that might have been a little bit political, after initially telling the American people that we were at war and he was a wartime president, which he said, suggesting a strong federal oversight and response to the handling of COVID. After a time when we saw COVID initially ravage states along the East Coast, particularly in the Northeast, and the West Coast of the United States, as well as states like Michigan and Illinois, states that are governed by Democrats and tend to be blue in election time. Some believe that maybe even as a bit of strategy, the president and his advisors, particularly Jared Kushner, decided that they were going to decentralize many of the aspects of testing and of mandating and of further shutting down the American people and calling for quarantining orders. And as the virus continued to spread, the prevalence of it in blue states might have been blamed on blue governors and blue legislators, and many of the effects of COVID would not be placed directly at the doorstep of the White House. The president, of course, soon was utilizing, of course, social media, as he does so well, to tweet, "Liberate Michigan," to criticize governors who were pursuing what he considered to be too stringent policies to control COVID. And for a time, of course, we saw the president every afternoon coming out and speaking at these meetings of the coronavirus task force, ostensibly chaired by Vice President Pence, all the way until the virus reemerged later in the summer of this year. And of course, we now are standing here when the Thanksgiving season has seen a very ferocious reoccurrence of the virus. So polling tells us that when Americans went to vote on November the 3rd, those who voted for former Vice President Biden, the Democratic nominee, stated that COVID and the response to COVID was the most important factor that they utilized in determining for whom they would vote. So July saw both parties hold their conventions. And again, most part, they were virtual conventions through the magic of Zoom and pre-recorded announcements and pre-recorded speeches. The president making, of course, a live acceptance speech from the grounds of the White House at the end of the Democratic convention. And we saw the general election campaign begin. Biden running as a Democratic nominee, spending at one point about 2 months in his home in Delaware, literally from his basement, sending out videos urging Americans to be cautious, find a plan to vote, but I think trying to demonstrate that he was abiding by health experts who said that people should practice social distancing. Biden ubiquitously always wore a mask and for the most part avoided large gatherings. On the other hand, the president eventually returned to his very successful style of campaigning. The live rallies, in most cases held in outdoor venues, lots of them in aircraft hangars. But again, the president feeding off the energy of thousands of people who oftentimes maskless and almost always not distanced, came to show their adulation and their support for the president seeking a second term. Now, through the summer, in many states, we were watching those postponed and delayed primaries and caucuses finally take place. And in most states, certainly states that matter in presidential elections, places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia, state legislatures in some case relaxed the requirements for candidates to vote by mail, in some cases to receive no excuse needed absentee ballots, and other states like Pennsylvania essentially creating and utilizing for the first time vote by mail opportunities, which previously and in previous presidential elections had not been as easy to obtain in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The votes started coming in from these primaries and caucuses. They were slow, they were cumbersome to count, there were complaints of malfunctioning in the collection of mail-in ballots. And right around this time, we would see the president, I think, both innately and tactically, come to be very suspicious of mail-in voting. The president would go on the offensive and basically begin in June and July stating that if states were going to conduct their presidential elections by mail-in voting, by easy absentee voting, by even increased early voting, the election was going to be fixed, the election was going to be rigged, and the election process in the United States was going to be tainted. And this was a horse that the president beat pretty loudly and pretty consistently all the way to Election Day, even though in a number of states that usually are won by Republicans in modern times, like Florida, like Texas, and like Arizona, mail-in voting has been in existence for a rather long time, and these states have been very adept in collecting, counting, and producing the results of their mail-in votes on election night in order to make their elections run more smoothly. So the general campaign, election campaign, began early September, the Labor Day, the traditional starting point. Soon, of course, many states were already mailing out their mail-in ballots and their absentee ballots, and millions of votes began to be collected through the Postal Service or through dropping off ballots in drop-off points in counties and states all around the country. Again, the president very tenaciously arguing that this was a prescription for fraud. Some of the reasons, perhaps, for the president's suspicions, or maybe as a result of the president criticizing mail-in voting and absentee voting, was that we soon saw, before the election, a phenomenon that would be confirmed after the election. And that is that when the votes were counted in the presidential election, 27% of all voters nationwide had voted in person on election day. Another 20% of the electorate nationwide had voted in person early, many states having very generous early voting opportunities, and 46% of all votes nationwide were cast either by mail-in or through the use of an absentee ballot. 94% of all Americans after the election would state that it had been easy for them to vote, notwithstanding, of course, the fact that we were being ravaged by the COVID-19 virus. Look a little more deeply into the numbers, and we know that on election day, 67.6% of all eligible registered voters cast a vote. More than 67%, 2/3, by American standards, a phenomenal number, made even more phenomenal in light of the COVID virus, the highest turnout by percentage in any American presidential election since the election of 1900, 120 years ago. Now, how Republicans voted, or Trump supporters, Trump voters voted, and how Democrats voted differed significantly. Maybe in part to the president, again, talking about the untrustworthy nature of mail-in voting. President Trump's vote broke down to 37% of all the votes he received nationwide being cast on election day for President Trump, 30% being cast in live early voting opportunities before November the 3rd. 2/3 of his vote came in live voting of some sort or another, the remaining 33% coming via mail-in or absentee ballot voting. And again, very heavily in states like Florida and Texas and Arizona and Ohio that have made these ways of voting available for a rather long time. Now compare this, 2/3 live in one form or another for the president, with how Biden voters turned out. Just 17% of all the votes that Biden received were cast by people who made those votes on election day, November the 3rd. An additional 24% came from voters who went out and voted for former Vice President Biden live in early voting opportunities, and 58%, almost 3 out of 5 ballots that were eventually cast for Joe Biden were cast via mail-in or by early voting. So we should have known, and we mentioned this before, that given this very different way in which Trump voters expressed their preference versus Biden voters, and given the differences by which some state legislatures had enacted rules regarding when mail-in and absentee votes could actually be counted, meaning that states with more established mail-in voting systems, again, like Florida, Ohio, Texas, Arizona, counted the overwhelming majority of their mail-in and absentee votes as soon as they were received, and certainly most by election day, so they were ready to produce their results earlier in the process. On the other hand, states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin mandated that early votes and absentee votes, in some cases, could only be opened and could only begin to be counted on election day itself. So, the polls closed November the 3rd. We're sitting around our TVs, popcorn, popped a beer maybe, and watched the results come in. And what did we see? We saw that the states that had released all of their mail-in votes as the polls closed in Florida and in Texas and in Arizona and in Ohio released a lot of Biden votes, because again, almost 60% of all the votes cast for Biden were cast by mail. So you might have looked and said, oh my, Biden is leading in Florida. Look how close he is in Texas. He's charged ahead in Ohio. Only to find that by midnight or the very early morning of the day after the election, when all of the live in-person votes were counted, and again, 37% of President Trump's voters turned out on election day, President Trump had surpassed Biden and really won, with the exception of Arizona, Florida, Texas, and Ohio by a much larger margin than the polls had suggested. Now, on the other hand, in states that, again, only permitted the counting of mail-in and absentee votes to begin on election day itself, the early returns in these states showed again the results of the large in-person turnout and the large early voting turnout that President Trump had amassed in those states. At one point, President Trump led in Pennsylvania by 600,000 votes. And if you looked at the vote counts at midnight or early in the morning of the day following the election, you would see the president having leads in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia as well, for whatever it's worth, Nevada too, only to see, as the days went by and the task of, again, opening up, scanning, counting, what again were the 60% of Biden votes that came in by absentee and by mail, as those votes began to be counted, we would see President Trump's lead in a number of these states begin to shrink. And then eventually, a week or so after the election, in some cases sooner, we would see the president overtake it in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and we would see, of course, former Vice President Biden turn what had been two reliably red states, Republican voting states, actually very narrowly go for Biden. Again, the president's prophecy, suspicion, maybe the fear of people being able to vote by mail, ended up playing out day after day after day as all of the mail-in vote was finally counted. Now, as we stand here now, there are still votes, believe it or not, being counted in some places. New York is still counting a lot of votes, not changing the effect of the presidential election, but maybe a congressional seat or two. We see that nationwide, we don't look at the nationwide popular vote to elect our president, but as an indication of the enormous turnout in this race, Biden has amassed more than 80 million votes, 80,100,000 or so to be precise, which is about 11 million more than Barack Obama won in his significant victory over John McCain back in 2008. And we've seen at this point President Trump run up nearly 74 million votes nationwide, about 73,900,000, the largest vote total received by any incumbent president in American history. But when we compare the two numbers, Biden, again, a bit over 80 million, President Trump at about 74 million, we see that Biden has won the national popular vote by about 6 million votes, which is twice the number that Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote 4 years ago in 2016. Her margin was about 3 million votes. And again, a lot of these larger vote counts having to do with the 67% voter turnout in this election, much higher than the percent of the turnout 4 years ago. So percentage-wise, President-elect Biden won 51.1% of the national popular vote, a majority. President Trump at 47.1% himself. Biden's percent, 51.1%, the highest total won by a candidate defeating an incumbent president since FDR defeated Herbert Hoover in the election of 1932. So again, a significant turnout and a significant margin of victory nationally for the vice president, former vice president, now president-elect, but also a rather impressive margin in the electoral votes amassed by each of these two candidates. We know, of course, that when we voted on November the 3rd, what were taking place were, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine, 51, D.C. has 3 electoral votes, separate winner-take-all elections. We know that, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine, the candidate who wins the most votes in a state wins all of that state's predetermined number of electoral votes. Because there are 538 total electoral votes, and the Constitution requires that in order to be elected president, a candidate must win at least 270, the barest majority of 538. 270 is the magic number to win the presidency. And maybe to cap off a crazy, unforgettable year, it turns out that Joe Biden's margin of victory in the Electoral College, 306 to 232, is the same exact margin of victory that 4 years ago Donald Trump enjoyed when he defeated Hillary Clinton. A margin that at times, given his penchant for hyperbole, he's described as a landslide, one of the greatest margins of victory in recent history. That is now the margin that he was defeated this election by Joe Biden. So what happened? We know 4 years ago that in 2016, President Trump got to 306 because he won all of the states, including at the time Georgia and Arizona, that have in recent history reliably and traditionally voted for the Republican nominee for the presidency. And we know that 4 years ago, President Trump's margin of victory came because in addition to the reliably red state, he turned 3 blue states, the blue wall of defense, as those states are known, or were known until 2016, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all red for the first time in nearly 30 years in any of them, voting again for a Republican. So this year, we saw, of course, the tables turn. In 2016, President Trump won Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes by a total of 44,000 votes cast throughout the Keystone State. 4 years later, we saw Biden take Pennsylvania by a very narrow 1.2%. His margin of victory in Pennsylvania is now somewhere near 80,000 votes, not 60, but 80,000 votes. In Michigan, which President Trump won by 0.2% of the vote 4 years ago, 10,000 votes cast in the entirety of Michigan. This time around, Biden took Michigan by 2.8% of the vote, 150,000 votes. And finally, in Wisconsin, Trump defeated Hillary Clinton there by 23,000 votes in 2016. Biden won Wisconsin by probably a lesser margin, about 20,000 votes, 0.7%. These 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, delivered 46 electoral votes to President Trump by a combined 77,000 votes. Those were the votes that 4 years ago put President Trump over the top and got him to that 306 electoral vote march. This time around, Biden, in taking Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, won those 3 states by a combined 230,000 votes. He won all 46 of those states' electoral votes, which in and of itself would have been enough to deliver to Joe Biden the presidency, albeit by a narrower margin than it turned out to be, because Biden also very narrowly won Georgia and Arizona, turning these red states blue for the first time since the 70s in the case of Georgia and 1992 in the case of Arizona. No landslide, Trump had won Arizona and Georgia in 2016, but this time around, in votes that have already been certified by the secretaries of state of Georgia and Arizona, most of these have by now, or all of them have by now, Georgia was carried by Biden by 13,000 votes, 0.6% of the vote. Arizona, 11,000 votes, 0.3. So Georgia's 16 electoral votes and the 11 for Arizona pushed Biden's totals even higher to 306. Again, 232 for President Trump. Again, 67% turnout. A stupendous number. Now, we've heard from the president since Election Day. And what, to this point, we have not heard is the president concede, congratulating Joe Biden, making a call to Joe Biden, going before the American public and saying, we gave it our best, but we fell a little short. Donald Trump is not a politician. I suspect just about everyone else who ran for president in this election cycle at one time or another had lost a race, and we're all schooled up on the way you concede and you make a call and you talk to your supporters. We know, of course, that the legend of Donald Trump is of someone who only wins, maybe incapable of saying the word lose. We know that in anticipation of challenges to some aspects of recounts, to the legitimacy of some ballots, to the deadlines by which mail-in votes and absentee votes had to be received. In signature matching, how do you make sure that the person's signature on the ballot matches their signature on record with the state? Prior to the election, we know that the president's lawyers had won several victories regarding the timing of when ballots could be received, and in some cases, the requirements needed to verify signatures. We saw that the president had put together a very impressive team of attorneys, including major law firms like Jones Day. We saw Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel. We saw Jay Sekulow, who represented the president successfully in his impeachment trial, joining up to be part of a team who would be ready to go in and litigate any legitimate, bona fide, fact-based errors, fraud, irregularities, if there were very close results in a number of states. Now we know that 4 years ago, when Hillary Clinton lost the presidency to Donald Trump, again by 77,000 votes in toto, and just 10,000 votes in Michigan, she conceded that night, carped about it and groused about it afterwards when all these Russian things came out, but did not initiate any litigation, did not call for recounts. Only the Green Party candidate, if you recall, Jill Stein, asked for a recount in Wisconsin. But this time around, of course, things were different. Now, as the investigations of the recounts and of the counting of absentee voting and of same-day voting failed to show demonstrable fraud. Fraud that a lawyer could go into court and, consistent with their oath as an attorney, allege fraud because there was demonstrable proof of fraud. A number of the more mainstream lawyers and the law firms who had initially signed up to work for President Trump withdrew. Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, probably with some political aspirations of her own, were part of the president's team early on, but she's disappeared from the scene. For instance, there were allegations that in Pennsylvania, the president was denied, Republicans were denied having observers in the counting rooms, as the president calls them, when the votes were counted. Pennsylvania law gave the set or the amount of vote observers that each party could have as each county cast their votes, and mandated the distances away from which the vote counters they had to stand. So we heard and saw eventually a dichotomy emerge. We saw people like Rudy Giuliani. We saw people like Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, the husband and wife team of Joe DeGenova and Victoria Tenzing. Everybody knows Rudy Giuliani, America's mayor. But I suspect unless you are a Fox News viewer, or even if you've abandoned Fox because they've suddenly gone lefty and now gravitate over to Newsmax or the One American News Network, you may not have heard of Sidney Powell or Jenna Ellis or Joe DeGenova or Victoria Tenzing, because these are individuals who for a very long time in some cases have sort of been TV lawyers, more partisan than fact-based. Giuliani, of course, has a gift, I think, for propounding theories and dressing them up as facts, perhaps. And we've seen them out there. We saw Giuliani the week after the election, the Saturday after the election, at the Four Seasons Lawn and Garden Shop outside of Philadelphia. We saw him, and primarily Sidney Powell, at the headquarters of the Republican National Committee on November the 20th, along with DeGenova. It's about 75. His wife's about 79. Giuliani, I think, is 76. Jenna Ellis is younger, dubbing themselves the elite strike force. And they made, on that date, November the 20th, all kinds of accusations. Giuliani's performance taking place, while the black hair dye sort of dripped down the side of his face. Sidney Powell getting up before the cameras and saying that the company that created the voting machines used in Georgia and a number of states, a Canadian company called Dominion, was being controlled by communists and socialists, and Hugo Chavez, the former dictator of Venezuela, who's been dead for 7 years, to somehow subvert the election. She went on to suggest that the Republican governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and the Republican Secretary of State, an engineer by the name of Brad Rappelsberg, were somehow complicit in a multi-state plot to use these machines and other means to deliver votes that were cast for President Trump to Joe Biden. In order to overcome this margin, President Trump would somehow have to pick up 38 electoral votes, meaning he would have to overturn the results in at least 3 of the very close states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, maybe Nevada, as well as Georgia. So when we saw these press conferences and these allegations, I've recently, in my quest to be as far-minded and scoped as possible to watch news, subscribed to Newsmax and One American News Network, 2 networks that have yet to call the election for Joe Biden. It's the place where Sidney Powell and Giuliani has been spending a lot of times. The accusations get more and more extreme, outlandish, delusional. I don't know what's the right word, because those accusations have not materialized in any courtroom. There has not been a suggestion in any of President Trump's pleadings in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan or Georgia utilizing the word fraud, because an attorney appearing before a court is ethically bound to have a factual basis for assertions made before that court. To do otherwise would subject that attorney to being sanctioned either by the court or by the Bar Association in states where they're licensed. So after an attorney was asked by a judge in Pennsylvania, are you saying that no Trump poll watchers were permitted in these counties? The attorney had to say poll watchers were permitted. When the judge asked how many, the attorney said a number greater than 0. At which point the judge said, "Why are we here?" So we're watching we're watching a battle in the court of public opinion. We're watching again a lot of histrionics, a lot of complaints. The president has begun to speak out more, again, against an election that he claims he won by a lot, but was rigged, the product of fraud, stolen by him. Sleepy Joe, who can't put 2 words together in one iteration, became a criminal mastermind who was part of this multi-state conspiracy to take the election. So we're watching, in reality, these last efforts to try to find a way to have a court overturn the results of an election, to somehow take away some of these votes that constitute Biden's margin of victory. And we're also watching attempts to try to cause legislatures of many of these states to cast aside by December the 8th. That is the date by which states must release the roster of electors who are going to meet in every state capital on December the 14th, the Monday following the second Wednesday in December. That's required by federal law to cast the electoral votes that will result in this margin of victory officially. States that have winner-take-all systems mandate that the candidate who wins the most votes in a state has the right to have their electors, 29 in Florida, 38 in Texas, 3 in Delaware, 11 in Indiana, 6 in Nevada, and so on, to have their Biden or Trump electors cast each of the state's number of electoral votes for the candidate who won the popular vote in the state. So there are some efforts. The president invited the leaders of Michigan's legislature, both Republicans, to come to the White House. There was an event held in a hotel ballroom in, I think, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that was billed as a hearing, but it was actually a gathering of legislators in the Pennsylvania legislature to hear again individual complaints about voting irregularities, about things that individuals saw. Again, not a widespread multi-thousand vote scheme, but individual and in some cases anecdotal stories about some potential impropriety or inaction involving, again, handfuls of voters. So the hope that one of these legislatures, like Pennsylvania's or Michigan, will say, even though the certified vote count shows Biden winning by 150,000 votes, or about 80,000 in Pennsylvania, or about 13,000 in Georgia, which entitles Biden to receive that state's electoral votes, was wrong, and the legislature instead was going to nominate the electors committed to President Trump, who lost in those states, is again something of questionable legality. In many cases, Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin have Democratic governors who could subvert these attempts. Probably are not going to happen. The rule of law and the laws of American electoral politics are going to hold. And we know that the president has, again, who likes to lose? No one does. And again, his advisors are suggesting that maybe a statement he made before Thanksgiving to let the transition begin with the General Services Administration may be the closest thing that the president does to actually conceding. The challenge, talk about threading a needle, of giving the president a way to concede but not admit he lost, is a very fine needle to thread. And perhaps the way this is all going to end is the president is going to recognize that his term ends at noon on January the 20th. Will he invite Joe Biden to the White House, as previous presidents have invited their successors? Is he going to appear at the inauguration of former Vice President Biden? Is there going to be a live outdoor inauguration? I think is another question we'll talk about later. Or is he going to recognize that he could not undo these numbers and continue to maintain that he actually won and was the victim of a horrible fraud, a theft, a fix, a rigged election predetermined to remove him from office? Again, I try to present a lot of these things, and always have, as I see them, as objectively as I see them. And God knows I would not like to have, conspiratorially actually produce some evidence of a plot. But thus far, what you see on TV is for one purpose, because if none of those allegations manifest themselves in court pleadings at either the state level or the federal level, they will never be vindicated. Okay, enough of that. What happens going forward? Number one, Donald Trump remains, as long as he wants, a political force in the United States. Donald Trump, coming to the fore in 2016 and during his time as president, demonstrated many of the very powerful pulls and powers that presidents at various times in our history has used. Populism. He came to Washington as an outsider who was going to drain the swamp and vindicate many of the wrongs that had been perpetrated against different sectors of the American population. He practiced an ardent and still does form of nationalism. America first. Stop protecting, stop coddling, stop supporting other countries and waging foreign wars. Let's build schools and roads in America. A powerful message. He utilized protectionism in a way that certainly no modern Republican president would. The Republican Party, Ronald Reagan's Republican Party, George W. Bush's Republican Party, was the party of free trade. Protectionism, when it's existed in recent times in the United States, has been the province of Democrats, and for a long time, the powerful labor unions, whose members voted for Democrats and tried to stop the outflow of well-paying jobs, north, south, east, and west away from the United States. And most notably, we've seen the president utilize protective tariffs against China, Canada, Japan, Mexico, Brazil, as a way again to try to reinvigorate some sectors of the American economy, particularly our industrial base. The president first became known as someone running outside of the Republican mainstream in 2015 and in 2016 by practicing nativism. Not a slur, but again, a candidate saying we needed to do something to, number one, identify and remove people in our country illegally, building a wall between our country and Mexico, a very vivid way to describe what he would do as president, wall them off. The president, in his time in office, has greatly reduced the number of refugees, people who really need to get out of harm's way in whatever country they may be in danger within. The president, of course, has said there's other countries that can take refugees, and we've seen the number of refugees in the last 4 years that we accept decline. And more recently, the president has suggested and promised, if he were reelected, to reduce the number of legal immigrants we were going to take in our country. I wouldn't be surprised if before leaving office on January 20th, the president doesn't attempt to sign some executive order dealing with the phenomenon of birthright citizenship, something created in the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in the late 1860s, following the end of the Civil War, which said anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, originally intended for former slaves, now emancipated. Today, the birthright citizenship clause means that any baby born in the United States, even if their parents arrived here illegally, is born an American citizen. The president might make a statement regarding that. We know the Supreme Court is hearing a case where the president is proposing to not utilize for census purposes undocumented individuals who were counted and reported during this year's census process. They wouldn't count, which may, of course, affect the population in a number of states, given that the undocumented had previously been counted in censuses of that type. And of course, we know the president tickled a nerve that exists in many Americans, one of isolationism. And again, had looked very critically at members of NATO, the United Nations, countries that we've been protecting in Europe when they couldn't protect themselves after the Second World War, at South Korea and Japan and other now rich countries in Asia who we've been protecting since the end of World War II, because at the time they could not have. The president has held the feet to the fire, so to speak, of these countries, demanding that they bear more of the cost of the defenses that we provide them. Again, very legitimate points that resonated with the American population. Many of these, populism, nationalism, protectionism, nativism, isolationism, runs counter to the Reaganism brand of republicanism that has been, of course, dominant since Ronald Reagan's presidency. So whether or not the Republican Party returns to its Reaganist orientation, or perhaps becomes more of a Trumpist party, is something we're going to watch certainly between now and the next couple of election cycles, but even sooner, because of a very unusual Georgia election law. You got to wonder, what Georgia's legislature is thinking, because neither Kelly Loeffler or David Perdue, Georgia's two Republican senators, won an outright majority of votes. Biden won the presidential vote in Georgia. Both of them, Perdue against a man by the name of Joel Ossoff, Kelly Loeffler against Reverend Raphael Warnock, will have to face runoff elections on January the 5th of 2021. Loeffler, to win the right to occupy this Senate seat for 2 more years, she was appointed when Georgia Senator Johnny Isakson retired due to ill health. She will run, if she wins, or this seat will be on the ballot in 2022 for a full 6-year term. Perdue, a winner in 2014, is now trying to win a second term as United States Senator. So on January the 3rd, when the new Congress is sworn in, Perdue will become, for a period of time, an ex-senator. If he wins the runoff on January the 5th, whenever that may eventually be counted, he will then rejoin the ranks of Republicans in the United States Senate. Loeffler will remain in that Senate seat until a winner in her race is determined. Also, as soon as the beginning of December, Mark Kelly, the former astronaut and husband of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, defeated Martha McSally in a special election to fill out the remainder of the late John McCain's Senate seat, will take office by the time the lame duck session of the Senate reconvenes. So the numbers are going to change a little bit. Now, any candidate seeking re-election, particularly senators and governors in 2022, one of them is Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, has to recognize that President Trump has built a constituency that considers themselves Trump voters more than Republican voters. The president, denigrating this voting machine company and the aspersions cast against Georgia's Democratic governor and Democratic Secretary of State has caused panics within Georgia's Republican Party, fearing that Trump voters aren't going to turn out and vote on January the 5th when these two Senate seats. Why? I heard a voter recently say the results predetermined because these voting machines are rigged. The president made a trip, or will make a trip, to Georgia to campaign on behalf of these senators. So we know that in 2022, senators like Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Mark Kelly running for a full term after the completion of John McCain's term that he's going to serve the last 2 years of, will probably be returning for a full term, as will Kelly Loeffler, Florida's Marco Rubio, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Roy Blunt, one of the Republican leaders in the Senate, been kind of quiet, like Mitch McConnell during this period of time, as these allegations have been made. The seat held by Richard Burr in the battleground state of North Carolina. The president won North Carolina, but North Carolina is a battleground state. Richard Burr's seat's going to be on the ballot. Rob Portman, senator from Ohio. A lot of Trump voters in Ohio. Are they Portman voters as well? Pat Toomey, Republican senator from Pennsylvania, announced he's retiring. That's an open seat. Watch that race there. Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, in 2022 will have completed his second term. He said he was only going to serve 2 terms, but maybe he's having second thoughts. That might be an open seat. And of course, lots of other senators from more traditionally red states having to recognize that President Trump is not going to go away, and he might be able to support successful primary challenges to these Republican incumbents. The roster of Republicans who might run for the party's nomination in 2024 is long and impressive. Mike Pence, Vice President, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, are known to both have presidential aspirations. 3 Floridians, both of our senators, Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, our governor, Ron DeSantis, similarly testing presidential waters. Ted Cruz, Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor, ambassador to the UN, Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley from Missouri, Lindsey Graham, South Carolina, Rand Paul, the Libertarian from Kentucky, and others, all making noises about getting into the race, which could probably be stopped in their tracks if Donald Trump announces he wants to have another go at the presidency. The Constitution limits a president to 2 terms in office in toto. We know that Grover Cleveland, our 22nd and 24th president, was defeated seeking a second consecutive term and won only 4 years later. So there is a precedent for that. Will Donald Trump throw his hat in the ring? Will he announce maybe, on January 20th of next year, when Joe Biden is being inaugurated, the start of his campaign to become the Republican nominee for the president, or maybe Donald Trump Jr. or Ivanka Trump or Eric Trump, taking over the family business and leading this particular wing of the Republican Party. So, again, it's entertaining to hear the theories. If you're a political animal and like to watch this stuff, again, we've had like overtime following the election. And again, OAN and Newsmax is out there for all of us. Now, next year, we are hopefully, sooner rather than later, going to return to live lectures. Vaccine, vaccine, vaccine. Everybody's fingers are crossed. Until we get there, or until everyone feels that they safely want to return to a live environment, even if we do return to live lectures in some communities, we will for a time continue to provide a DVD dealing with the same topic so that no one has to, take any unreasonable risk to join us. We're going to stay with presidential politics just a little longer, like we did in 2017 after Donald Trump's victory. In January, we're going to begin a series called The First 100 Days, looking at the incoming presidential administration. We're going to do a lecture on inaugurations and look at some great immortal inaugural addresses from American history. The Constitution requires that a president from time to time speak to Congress regarding the state of the Union. That typically takes place in late January or maybe early February. An incoming president, just inaugurated, is not required to present a State of the Union speech per se, but guess what? In the television era, every recently elected president couldn't pass up an hour and a half of FaceTime to deliver what in 2017 and now in 2021 is going to be called a presidential address to Congress. And we might hear Joe Biden amplify many of his priorities for his term in office. We're going to look at the first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. It's where the term, the first 100 days, became famous. And many of the programs that would become part of the New Deal, which ultimately made American citizens more familiar, more dependent, more susceptible to actions of the federal government and to Congress, really came about or were germinated during the beginning of FDR's time in office. And then we're going to look in our final look before turning away from presidential politics. We're going to take a little journey later this year into history. We're going to go overseas to look at some important events that we maybe haven't focused on as much this year. In April, we're going to do a lecture entitled All the President's Men and Women, and review who ultimately ended up serving in Joe Biden's cabinet, who became important advisors, how hard was it to garner confirmation in the United States Senate, and probably by April, being a little gossipy at times, we'll probably be able to discuss some of the scandals, improprieties that I'm sure will have already been alleged against some member of the administration or of the president's family. It is the American way. So I hope everyone, of course, had a very happy Thanksgiving. And as we break, making our way to the end of the year, notwithstanding COVID, there's hope. There is a vaccine on the horizon. I wish everyone a very Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, a Happy Kwanzaa, if that's what you celebrate, and then come January 1st, an opportunity to take 2020 and forget about it, as I wish everyone a very happy New Year. So until January, Best wishes to all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.